Good morning. Well, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Miguel Escoto. I'm a recent graduate here at FIU, where I majored in international relations and political science. I'm also a former intelligence analyst fellow at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, where I researched the expansion of Chinese mining investments in Nicaragua and its impact on the Ortega Murillo regime's authoritarian resilience, as well as U.S. policy in the region. Today's Fireside Chat will examine leadership during times of uncertainty. This subject is especially important as Latin America navigates social, political, and economic challenges. This discussion will be moderated by Brian Winter, Editor-in-Chief at the Americas Quarterly and Vice President of Policy at Americas Society and Council of the Americas. Please join me with a warm round of applause to welcome our panelists today.
Thank you.
Buenos dias, good morning. Thank you all for being here. Congratulations to FIU for putting once again a great conference. You know, inevitably a security-focused conference like this one focuses a lot on topics like military cooperation, external threats, like the panel that we just saw, which was great. But it's also important to take a moment and not forget about good old-fashioned civilian leadership. Because after all, it's the civilian politicians who in most cases are not only going to be implementing security policy, but are the ones who need to get elected and who need to stay in office, who need to convince civilian populations in their countries of the need for a tough line against security and to believe in the possibility that progress is possible. So I was glad that FIU organized this panel and with an exceptional two speakers, with President Chinchilla and with Jose. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Yeah.
So my first question for both of you, I mean, look, in virtually every country in Latin America right now, crime shows up as the #1 issue for voters. Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Chile. All of these are countries where organized crime has played an important role in recent elections. But progress has been elusive, even in countries where presidents have been elected with a mandate to combat organized crime. So my first question for you, and President Chinchilla, to start with you, what is the single most important thing that civilian leadership must do today in order to effectively battle organized crime?
Well, thank you very much, Brian. It is a pleasure also to be in this panel with Jose. And thank you, FIU, for inviting us to have this very relevant conversation. According to my view and my different studies on the issue, I have dedicated most of my professional career not only to politics, but also to analyze the security and criminality issue in Latin America especially. And for sure, I mean, this is nowadays, probably is the most important challenge that we have in terms of our institutional stability, the one related to organized crime especially. But before answering your question, which is a very specific question, just let me make two important comments just to situate in a better way the issue of violence, security, and criminality. Number one, this is nothing new for Latin America. Right. For many years, Latin America has been heading the indicators of the most violent region in the world in terms of the homicide rates per 100,000 inhabitants. So number one, again, this is not a new problem for Latin America. The thing is that the situation has changed dramatically, not because we still have the most dangerous countries in the world, not necessarily now in Central America, but in the Caribbean, but because the nature of the problem became even more complex. Right. Because today, what is defining the new security scenarios are very closely linked to the phenomenon of organized crime. And the second comment I want to make is that when we talk about security, criminality, violence, those are multifaceted kind of problems. So we cannot pretend to resolve or to tackle those problems with a single policy. So usually what I recommend, and that was my experience as a decision maker when I was president of Costa Rica, that what you need to design is an integral approach to tackle the problem, where prevention is going to be important, at the same time that you will need more effective control mechanisms through law enforcement agencies, and also trying to respond to the very huge problem we have in our countries, which has to do with impunity. So that means trying to punish those responsible for the crime. So having said this, if I will need to choose something that should become a priority for most of the Latin American countries right now, it will has to do with designing a more effective system in which we can get the best possible information along with the best possible intelligence and analysis of that information, including financial information, and that information being or becoming the main input of very professional, independent, and transparent law enforcement and judicial institutions. So for me, creating this, this ecosystem, this system of institutions working together is very important. We need to recognize that one of the weakest links of our democracies is the rule of law. Right. So investing in a professional, independent, and well-equipped, and also better prepared to face that information, judicial institutions and law enforcement agency is becoming, probably according to my view, the most important challenge that we have today.
It's interesting you mentioned information sharing. I travel the region a lot, yes, and I meet with leaders on left, center, and right, and they all say the same thing. They say our governments are not talking to each other. We're dealing in many cases with the same organized crime groups, but there is a shocking lack of mechanisms and also informal channels among governments in order to communicate, in order to just share basic, not only financial information, but best practices when it comes to battling some of these groups. And I would note that it's made worse by the polarization that characterizes all of our countries right now. At a time when you have, presidents who not only don't speak to each other, but who are throwing darts at each other on social media, calling each other murderer and communist and everything like that, that does, in practice, I'm told, have a chilling effect on things like diplomacy and the sharing of information. So, maybe we're seeing some progress on that now through initiatives like Shield of the Americas. There was some discussion of this yesterday.
We cannot face a kind of transnational problem without the right actions at the transnational also level. So international cooperation, as you mentioned, is key.
So Jose, I want to come to you. You know the region really well. I want to ask you the same question that I asked the president, which is, as you in your interactions with leaders over the last couple of years from Latin America, what's your impression of the most important step that governments need to take on this topic?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, thank you to FIU for this opportunity. I'm a proud graduate, proud Panther, and it's amazing to be here. But I think the way you answered the question just now is phenomenal because it is a multifaceted challenge. I've worked in the political world for a long time, and we do a lot of polling, and sometimes when you ask those questions and people say crime, it's far more complicated than just one aspect of crime. Crime means that you can't you can't go to work every day, or you can't have safety in the workplace, safety at home, your children are at risk. It affects every aspect of society. And to your point, the rule of law, making sure that the judicial system's working properly, that people are properly trained. And just to add to that, you mentioned just now institutions, and I'd be remiss not to recognize our ambassador to the Organization of American States, Ambassador Rizzuto, who's here with us, and I'm honored that you're here to listen to us, but I think it demonstrates the ambassador's commitment, President Trump's commitment, and this administration's commitment to the region and to this issue. I've been fortunate enough to work at the White House, at the State Department, and understand the policymaking apparatus and how some of those things work, but it is action that matters. And I think you just mentioned the Shield of the Americas conference. Those were really solid conversations that were being had, and I was lucky to play a small role on the logistics side of that. And the amount of bilateral meetings that took place that were not part of the actual forum or the discussion that was made public, there were some private ones, but that's where a lot of business was transacted. And there were, if I say 100, that might be too small, between heads of states, senior level officials of the US government, and sometimes heads of states with each other, and coordinating and talking about how we can address these challenges with security, especially as it comes to these narco-terrorist organizations being at the heart of that.
Another thing that I think about is communication, is the need that politicians have to show their people that progress is possible. One of the things that I've done in my career is every so often I help people write books. And I helped President Uribe of Colombia write his memoirs when he left the presidency in 2010. One thing that really struck me about his experience was how he believed in the notion, the importance of early victories. And this was 20 years ago, and to your point, organized crime is not a new issue, but it has evolved in new ways, and maybe it's worth reaching back to remember some of these tactics. Two things that Uribe did. One was on the first day of his government, the first thing they did was they went wheels up in the presidential plane, and they went to Valledupar, which at the time was arguably the most violent part of Colombia. And they did that to prove not only to the citizens of Valledupar, but to Colombia at large, that they were going to face this problem head on, that they were not going to hide from the armed groups. And then the second thing they did, or not sequentially, I mean, it wasn't the first day, but they made it a priority early in Uribe's government to open up the highways between important cities, which in those years, in the 90s and the early 2000s, were controlled by some of these armed groups. Most civilians avoided them for fear of kidnapping, and they organized caravans. Before they really established, command and control of those areas, what they did was they had the military go, and they would go between, let's say, Cali and, I don't know, Medellin, and they'd go in caravans that included military vehicles. People would fly flags, Colombian flags, outside their cars because they were so proud to be making that trip. They were so proud that those highways were at least temporarily opened back up again. And these were symbolic moments, communications, feats of communication that showed people early on that some progress was possible. And I wonder if those are things that today's governments can and should take lessons from as well.
Of course, I think those kind of early victories give you the necessary space to continue implementing additional policies. And I think that was key to the success that President Uribe achieved, not only during the period he was president, but also it was a kind of lasting effects that he got for Colombia. Yeah. And that is important to say because in certain way, part of the trap that we find in our countries is the short-termism, defining the decisions of the politicians. So sometimes they are only concerned about those very early victories, but nothing to guarantee that the results will be sustained for the years to come. We need to understand in a certain way that the short and long term start at the same time. Because the decisions you are taking today, it doesn't matter if the results are going to be in the short time, but they will define also the long term.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that is why it is very important to continue calling the attention of investing in the rule of law, on investing on independent judiciaries, professional justices, well-informed and prepared prosecutors, and try to get politics out of the judicial branch. On the contrary, what you are seeing today, and I understand this about early victories, what you are seeing is the priority giving to those kind of operations that brings the army to the streets. It's good because it creates this feeling of security among the population, but in the long term, it is almost impossible to sustain a successful policy just doing what some governments are doing today. So that is one of the main concerns that we have in Latin America, because we have seen this in other occasions, but the problem is how to sustain the long-term kind of results that we need.
That's right.
In the region.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and yeah, that's very thoughtful answer about how the challenges, and you've have lived experience in that space. So I know you're speaking from the heart because you've addressed these challenges head on. And whenever I'm giving advice to either folks that I've worked for or that we're consulting for through the firm, heads of states, other leaders, from mayors all the way to senators, et cetera, one of the most important things you need to do, and I think that goes to your point of President Uribe, is engage, be present, and demonstrate to people that you truly understand and you truly care about them. You've got to show them that you care about their issues, their suffering, their pain points. But the second part to that is that you got to lead with ideas, right? You got to demonstrate that your ideas are better, and you got to make that connection to the policy. Yes. I think we've seen a lot of, and I'm sure you can also have witnessed some of this, leaders or governments that maybe do that first part extremely well, and they drive that narrative very well, but they never deliver on that second part. And so eventually, either it leads the country into a worse situation because they've been, fallen into this false sense of security. Terrible things continue to happen, but yet somehow they believe in these folks and they're highly disappointed, leading to some inflection point in the national politic. Or they do the second part really well, which is amazing. They're technically very capable, but they never tell the story.
Right.
So others are defining the story for them and presenting a different case. So I think when you have that ability to do both of those things, that's why in the world we're in today, that communication and strategic piece, and that's a lot of what we do as a firm. We give that kind of advice or do that type of analysis, whether it's through our risk and investigations practice, our strategic comms, or advocacy strategies. But we see this every day more and more being vital. It's no longer just a good recommendation as it was, say, 15, 20 years ago. It has to be part of the way that you operate. You can't just be focused on the technical and do a great job. You have to tell the story, you have to shape a narrative, and you got to be out there communicating constantly.
Well, Jose, that leads me to my next question, which I want to direct toward you, which is, it's well known at this point that Latin America seems to be shifting to the right. We've seen that in recent elections in Bolivia and Chile. We'll see if it continues in upcoming elections in 2026 in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. But it's interesting, this generation that's come in seems more willing to talk about security than the previous ones were. And I think specific examples. I think President Cast in Chile has made it, one of his main banderas to a greater extent, perhaps, than President Piñera did. I think you could say the same thing about President Mallea, perhaps compared to President Macri, again, the sort of predecessor on the right. These are figures who are understanding the current moment, who are putting security at the forefront of their public messaging. You've worked with some of these new leaders. You've seen them at conferences. What ties them together, and what do you think the biggest challenge facing this generation of leaders on the new right in the region is when it comes to security?
That's an excellent question. I think one of the things that has led to this moment, kind of a little bit of what I was just talking about, sort of the populist style of some of these governments that they've come in They're replaced without delivering results, empty promises that were never fulfilled. And eventually, that led to this inflection point, right? That led to a new individual or a rise of a movement or whatever. I think politically, they actually are very distinct. President Mallea is very much a libertarian. And his point of view is very, very much comes from that world, and he's an economist, and he's full-throated about it. And he does a great job of explaining these very complicated, high-level principles. Whereas others might be more, center-right, but maybe have a connection when it comes to the security issue with some of the more conservative policies. But I think what makes them capable of doing that job is the fact that they're strong communicators. And the way that politics and just the world has evolved so much when it comes to digital media, social media. President Mallea's movement, and I see one of the top reporters that covers that here from InfoBuy. I just saw him walk in, he's sitting over there, and him and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, was driven by a grassroots social media campaign that caught fire. And it was the young people of Argentina that came, and there were a lot of grievances, a lot of pain points, and that still exist today. But now what we've seen is that if he had delivered that victory without actual action, I don't think he would be able to stay in power too long, because expectations were very high. And he's been able to do that. Some of that also, and we have to give credit where credit is due, I would say, is the leadership of President Trump. Because he understands that better than anyone, frankly. He's probably the greatest communicator when it comes to understanding the moment, the timing of messaging, and he understood the timing of when he needed to get involved, for example. And his involvement, I think, has allowed some of these individuals to have even a greater voice and a bigger platform. And it's not necessarily, people are always sensitive about, is the U.S. meddling in elections? And so not necessarily. He's just using his platform to share his point of view, tell folks who he supports, and give them oxygen. And that oxygen in Latin America is super, super helpful and leads to, the movement. Now, what connects them together, I think that's where we have to have a leadership role here in the U.S. and provide thought leadership, guidance, and to your point, support. Because some of these things that you're talking about, reforming the rule of law, providing training. I know the team, there's been folks here from Southcom and so on who are doing an incredible job. They've been holding a number of conferences themselves to provide technical assistance. The State Department does this really well through INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, but there is so much that we need to do in the hemisphere, but we need to have that nexus. And I think the U.S. is starting to play that role more and more, at least in this administration.
Thanks, Jose. I want to talk more about the importance of the United States on this issue, but before we do, I want to ask a specific question about Costa Rica. During your presidency, President Chinchilla, Costa Rica was still something of, in relative terms, an oasis when it came to security issues. That's no longer the case today. It's a country that now has a homicide rate that has almost doubled, stands at about 16 per 100,000. That's even higher, according to some studies, than Guatemala's now. What are the lessons of the Costa Rican experience over the last decade for the rest of Latin America?
The first lesson, I will say, is that we demonstrated that it is possible to tackle violence and crime without sacrificing the rule of law. Because we were very successful. We were able to decrease the homicide rates by about 30% in 4 years. Also the femicides and many other kind of petty crimes. But also something very important, the perception of insecurity among the people also decreased. And that is, in political terms, is very important in terms of communication, because we cannot ignore that part. I mean, the subjective component of any security policy. You need to keep that in mind. Sometimes, and that is the case of Chile, in Chile, they still have very low homicide rates, but they have one of the highest perceptions of insecurity among the population. And so, the first lesson is that one, because now it seems that there is this idea that the only way to tackle the problem of crime and security is by sacrificing the rule of law. Of course, we need to understand that impunity, again, is a big issue, and that we need to do something with justices, with the prosecutors. They need to understand that they have to adopt many different reforms in order to be more effective in punishing crime. But it doesn't mean that we need to, for example, fire all the justices just because they are 50 years old or more, for example. Or because I just want to change the way we elect the justices. And so we are going to fire all those that were elected before, with career, with experience, etc. So this is the number one lesson. The second lesson is that in order to keep the early kind of victories, you need to avoid the short-termism. In our case, we introduced the reforms, the legal reforms, the institutional reforms. We invested in training our people. We tried to neutralize the risk factors at the community levels. Let me give you an example. We in Latin America and the Caribbean have about 20 million young people who neither work nor study. So that means that they are becoming, those who will move to the organized crime, to the gangs, to continue feeding the problem of crime. So all of those policies were in place. But since the coming governments felt that it was not longer a priority in terms of citizens' perception, they let their guard down. And you can never do that. Tackling or combating crime is something governments must do every day, every hour. It's a kind of job that never stops.
We're in an era now where, actually, there's one comment I want to make, which is, you mentioned Chile. And the perceptions of crime being so high. And I was just there last month, and it was interesting because you hear this, even Chilean politicians will say, I don't understand why people are so focused on this, because in relative terms, we're so far from being Colombia or from being Mexico. But the truth is, that's not how Chileans think, right? They're not comparing their country compared to Colombia or Mexico. They're comparing it to Chile. And they sense that organized crime is making inroads, and they want to avoid that scenario. Switching gears a bit, this is without a doubt the White House that is most focused on Latin America of any in at least 40 years. And we've invented this phrase, the Don Rowe Doctrine. I think the New York Post came up with it first. We wanted to use it in America's Quarterly, and we were like, I don't know, maybe the president might not like it. And then, of course, he used it, I think, at the press conference on the morning of January 3rd after the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Jose, starting with you, I mean, why do you think the hemisphere has become so much more a priority for this administration, even compared to President Trump's first administration? And where do you think the opportunities are for Latin American governments on security? Because of this peak of interest?
Absolutely, and I think back to 2001. I got to serve in the Bush administration, was at the White House in the Chief of Staff's office, and back then, in those first 9 months of 2001, you had the Partnership for Prosperity with Mexico. President Bush had a big emphasis on Latin America, being a Texas governor. You had the Free Trade Area of the Americas that FIU even was involved with, and big conferences were happening. And all of a sudden, you had 9/11. And I remember Vicente Fox had been to the White House September 3rd or 4th, a week before. Everything changed. And at that point, so I think as a government, there was a need to do something about Latin America and get connected and build these tentacles and this connective tissue. But everything changed, and the priorities of the United States shifted, understandably so, to the war on terror. We had that for the better part of 20 years. And I think President Trump was sort of at the tail end of that moment and understood very well what still needed to happen. I think that 16 to 20 period for him, even though he did accomplish some of those international objectives that he pursued as it related to China, something he had been talking about since the 80s, but I feel like almost it was this window where he got to see and get an assessment of what had happened. And it's very unique that a president leaves office, has 4 years outside of government, and then comes back. And in those 4 years, that's a time of reflection. A lot of presidents, after they leave office, they can look back and say, I wish I could have done this, I wish I could have done that. In President Trump's case, he actually got to come back now and do it. Right. And which is why they have been so prepared and so well aligned to so many policy issues. People ask me all the time, isn't it too much that they're doing? Well, if you're prepared and you have the right team and you have the talent and the willpower, you can accomplish all these things. So I think the focus on Latin America comes from that time period and the realization that we had neglected our backyard for too long, that we had not been connected to countries that we should have been connected to, and we allowed. Not that it's exclusively our responsibility, because like the president mentioned, impunity, is a major problem, and you're absolutely right, that needs to be addressed. And other international organizations have been talking about these things, but he's a leader that likes to act. And so he decided, hey, this is gonna be at the core of a national security strategy. I was having a conversation yesterday with the National Security Western Hemisphere Director, Michael Jensen, who was on the stage and had a great session. But he talked about that, how that came together, and how it was the president who said, we need to do this. And then, of course, Secretary Rubio, who probably understands the region and the hemisphere better than anyone, who led with his team in creating this document. When that document came out, a lot of folks looked at it and almost maybe, I don't know if they giggled. I would talk to people, they're like, that can't be real. It's a little bit sensational. It's real. Take him at his word. That is exactly what they're doing. Everything in that document, everything that was described when it came to building the financial relationships, providing the necessary support, training, security, fighting narco-terrorism, ridding the world of these authoritarian dictatorships, energy independence, minerals, all those things that are in there are part of the plan and they're coming to fruition. So I think we're gonna see a moment now for the next several years that I think is gonna transform the region, but honestly, it's gonna transform the relationship and the leadership of the United States and the connection that is long overdue in the region.
President Chinchilla, how do you interpret the interest of this White House in Latin America? How does it compare to the interactions that you had with Washington when you were president? And what do you see as both the opportunities and the potential risks from this level of engagement?
I have had many different experiences with Washington because the first time that I had the opportunity to engage in a very serious conversation, a strategic conversation about the future of the region, especially on security, was when I was Minister of Security at that time. That was between 1994, 1994, 1995.
Wasn't that long ago?
Yes. And so I remember that at that time, there was a very important interest and significant interest in Latin America in terms of putting, many efforts, an integral vision, a strategic vision about what was coming with the organized crimes. And so I will say that almost every significant action related to the last security strategy started at that time. The problem was that the strategy was not reviewed on a regular basis. It was not adjusted. And so the results, in certain way, also were not the ones we were expecting to have. Now we have this attention that President Trump is putting on our region, and I think that for sure, Jose already said, that gave us a huge opportunity because in certain way, Latin America is back to the international agenda.
Yeah.
Okay, we have become again a very visible region. We had almost vanished from the international arena. I participate in many forums, for example, in Europe, and it's very hard to find something about Latin America in European forums. Now Latin America is back there. So I think that if our governments use this opportunity to really do three things that are, for me, are important. Number one is try to come together again inside Latin America to restore that internal dialogue and political cooperation that was lost before. I think that will be very good, because now we also have this political opportunity with many right-leaning governments governing the region at the same time. So if they create this dynamic of political cooperation among them, I think they can use those possibilities that President Trump are offering to Latin America in a more intelligent way. And secondly, I will say that also they will need to try to influence with their voice in Washington, so we can do not only see the kind of unilateral military actions to respond to those security challenges, but to convince Washington about the need to continue strengthening the diplomatic means and also the cooperation with the law enforcement agencies. I will say that it is up to the governments in Latin America to try to balance in a more intelligent way the strategy that Washington is now trying for our countries.
Let me ask a related question that's a little bit delicate. I spent some time over the Christmas holiday reading or rereading books about the history of ties between the United States and Latin America, because I'm kind of a weird guy and that's what I like to do in my spare time. And one of the things you see is that these periods of very intense US activity in Latin America, like we saw 100 years ago, corollaries and doctrines that are now being sort of openly invoked in the current context, often produced some short-term successes, but a backlash against the United States over the medium and long term. And look, you can draw a direct line between Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick and the Roosevelt corollary of the 1900s to the rise of nationalist sentiment in Cuba, to all the way through to Peronism, the Cuban Revolution, and even Hugo Chavez and el socialismo del siglo XXI. All of these movements had a strong anti-imperialist, anti-US sentiment at their core, drawing from that history. So my question to both of you is, do you have any thoughts on how both the US government and governments in the region can help try to avoid a similar backlash in years to come, given that we're seeing such an active Latin America policy from this White House?
Yes, well, again, when you go back to probably the most successful years of cooperation between Washington and Latin America, that happened during the 90s. In the 90s, we were able to get consensus around the importance of development cooperation in certain areas, very well focused. I understand that in many countries in Latin America, probably you don't need any more of that kind of cooperation, but there are still some countries that truly need it. If we would need, again, for example, to tackle in a sustained way the risk factors that explains migration, okay? Because sooner or later, probably that will go back. So that would be back. The second component that was very successful was trade. My country is probably one of the best examples. We were able to grow and create a very dynamic economy thanks to the trade opportunities that the United States created around the Americas. So I think that in that sense, and that's my very sincere opinion, weaponizing tariffs as an instrument for punishing governments, I think it is a very bad idea, okay? And finally, diplomacy. Diplomacy as a complement of the use of military force, because I understand that given the current circumstances of the huge menace that organized crime represents for the hemisphere, it is important to scale up the operations with the participation of the military. But at the same time, we cannot forget about the important role of soft power, because concerning the soft power, United States is probably the country who really knows how to use it as compared with, for example, China or Russia in our region.
It's interesting to hear you. What I'm hearing from you is it can't be just security by itself. It has to go hand in hand with diplomacy, with commercial ties, with soft power. And it's interesting, we heard a similar message from Mike Jensen, who you mentioned, the National Security Advisor, yesterday, talking about how they are essentially standing by now with a flood of resources for economic investment and looking for projects.
Absolutely.
Jose, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right, and what the president describes is spot on. Like those are foundational things that you have to have, and at the end of the day, you have to deliver the results. And the way to do that, once you've invested the time, the hard work that goes into doing that, and building those relationships and so on, is unleash the power of the free market, unleash the free enterprise system, allow for people's lives to get better. To your point, what Michael Jensen was mentioning yesterday. And those principles, I think on their own, people's lives will flourish, their quality of living will improve, and there is an opportunity with the economic, the right economic incentives and alignment of policy and trade policy. I know right now, USMCA is a big issue, for example, between the US, Mexico, and Canada. That negotiation is taking place, but it's not taking place in a vacuum. There are security concerns and other things that are happening around that. So those are things that I think need to be done the right way, in the responsible way. And once we get through these potential, maybe even a painful period at times, like that negotiation, for example, we can unleash some of this economic resurgence. The region has incredible talent, the people. In most of the countries that we travel to, that I've traveled to, you find just amazing talent, a lot of capability, a lot of folks who've even left their countries that would be willing to go back if the right opportunities were there for them. So I think that also addresses maybe some of the migration matters as well. If opportunities are in someone's country, why would they want to leave if they can provide for their families and be close to their homeland and the rest of their loved ones, right? Nobody wants to leave that behind, but sometimes they don't necessarily have a choice, either because of security, lack of opportunity. So I think if we can get this right, to answer your question, we won't see that whiplash response. Now, politics and sentiment is not a straight line. It goes up and down for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes world events or things that you can't control. So you could see some of that happen. It happens here domestically. We have these 2-year cycles, 4-year cycles, and there's always this, up and down. But I think for the region, as long as we're in that up and down, we're progressing in the right way, and incomes are going up, and quality of life is going up, and sentiment about things like security are improving. I think we're going to be in good shape.
President Chinchilla, we have about a minute left. I want to give the final question to you. You mentioned that this organized crime issue, it's not a new issue. Here we are, still talking about it again, and it has gotten worse. It's a threat that has evolved because of the diversification of these organized crime groups. As you think about what would be necessary for real progress, taking advantage of this political cycle that we're in right now, what's the thing that you think would actually make a difference?
The difference, again, I will put all the emphasis that I could on strengthening, again, the rule of law. I think that is the weakest component of our democracies, and I think that the only way we can really sustain good results in the long term is investing on robust institutions of the rule of law.
I want to thank you both for a conversation that has been nuanced
Thank you.
and dynamic and surprising in many ways. A round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.